Hello, Roots family. I am so happy to be joining you today as we continue our conversation about the church as a forged family. As we continue to consider what does it look like for us to reframe the way that we think about church, the way that we come to church, and the way that we embody being the church of Jesus Christ. I am going to begin our time in a little different way. So, as many of you know, I've been taking spiritual direction training to become a director. And one of the things that I have just fallen in love with is the intentionality before we begin to share anything. To hold silence or to acknowledge God's presence in some way, shape, or form. So, for today's message, I would like to acknowledge God's presence with this. This is a centerpiece that I've purchased for our family's table. And when we gather together again in person, you will see this centerpiece on our tables. This is either called a circle of friends or a prayer circle. There is a larger version of this in my program where whenever we gather and we begin to talk about our reflections to the reading, or we begin to share in group about where we've seen God, we sit around this, and our leader lights a candle in the middle of it. And this candle is lit to remind us that we gather together and we bring our full selves. We create this unbreakable bond of a circle of love and community and trust, but we do it for a purpose. Christ is in the midst of us. And the candle reminds us that we gather not just to share good thoughts or prayer requests, not just to be contemplative and woo-woo, but we gather because of Christ. And this reminds us to take moments while we're talking to pause, to breathe in and breathe out, to offer gratitude, to ask the Spirit for guidance. So when we gather together again, you are going to see this centerpiece, and it's going to be our reminder that we are a distinct circle of friends, a circle of friends who gather together because of Christ. So I'm going to keep this candle here while I teach. So we are in the middle of this sermon series called Forged Family. And I am hopeful that you have, or I'm hoping that you have been encouraged to think about the church as a family. I know we have had some extensive conversations between Pastor TC's message last week, or the week before last, and then our conversations last week on what to do when there's conflict in our family, when the dynamic is off, or when there's things that we need to think about and we need to talk about. And I hope that that was an encouraging and challenging message for you, because I know that it is, and it was and is for me. I love to please people. I love for everybody to like me. I love to like everyone else, and I don't always want to have hard conversations or put myself in situations where I have to address a need or a concern, or even the vulnerability of addressing a need or concern. And so I hope that Pastor TC's message gave you the encouragement that you need, or even just the courage that you need to ask the Spirit, how can you be more vulnerable and straightforward and honestly loving in the way we communicate with each other. And I believe that that is a conversation that we're going to continually be having as we begin to as we forge our family and we begin to spend more time with one another. We have a town hall coming up where we are going to be sharing some of the next steps in the life of Roots, some of the plans for fall and for winter, where we're going to be sharing with you our plans for gathering together, for offering more opportunity for us to embody being a forged family. And I know that for some of us that might feel a little scary. It might feel a little inconvenient. It might feel a little irrelevant. That is part of my story. I know exactly how many of you feel, because I've been there. When I came to faith, I was a young girl who was baptized about at the age of 7, and in one tradition. And then I started to go to church in another tradition. So I was baptized in a Baptist church, but then I really kind of found my community and my forged family at the Assembly of God church, like literally right down the street from the Baptist church. It's a whole long story about how I moved from one church to the other, but I remember the very first Sunday I visited that church. It was because I was invited by another friend who attended that church. They had like a cool sort of preteen program that was a feeder into the youth group, and she invited me to go there. And her family picked me up, and we drove there, and I remember walking in to this very traditional church building. It had a steeple and kind of like a foyer that kind of came to a V, and there were glass doors on either side, and so you would walk up and you'd see the cross, and you'd see this like pointed entryway, and then the two doors would open up, and on either side of the doors when you're walking up there would be a greeter. And on the side that I came up to, there was a man who I promise you was a dead ringer for John Candy. He was standing there and he was holding bulletins in his hands and had a big smile on his face. And I walked up to him to get a bulletin, and he said, "Good morning, little sister." And I was amazed. I, I thought to myself, who is this white man who I don't even know calling me sister? And as I went into church and kind of got situated, I could hear his deep booming voice from outside, and he would greet everyone with either sister or brother. And if he knew their name, he would say, "Good morning, Sister Sharon. Good morning, Brother Paul." And if it was a visitor, he'd say, "Good morning, little sister. Good morning, little brother. Good morning, brother. Good morning, sister." That was his specific way of greeting people into the church building. I kept hearing him use brother and sister over and over again. And every time I heard him say sister, I was filled with a little bit of hope and an actual encouragement. It was the first time that being a sister gave me, or imagining myself as a sister gave me those feelings, because being a little sister was full of landmines for me. I had a terrible dynamic in my family of origin. As some of you know, my mom and dad were never married because my dad is still technically married to his first wife. So from my birth until the age of 14, I lived with my mom and my dad, his wife, and their son, who's 12 years older than me. And that son abused me in a variety of ways when I was a little girl. I didn't like being a little sister because a little sister meant that I was vulnerable, that I could be hurt, that I was not loved, that I was only loved or accepted when I did things that my brother wanted me to. I didn't really like the idea of being a little sister when I was at home. But sitting in those pews, hearing John say little sister over and over again, or Sister Sharon, Sister Casey, I felt that there could be something redeemed about the idea of being a sister, because I was a part of a new family. I was in a space where a different family was being forged than the one I was used to. Church was the one time in my week when I could get away from all of those dynamics, where I could ask questions about God, they would be answered. Maybe not with the most theologically astute answer, but in ways that were earnest and loving. I met people who exuded joy, real joy, and I began to understand the distinct practices that Jesus taught us, like prayer and worshiping God, taking communion, and passing the peace. Today we are going to read about the church that looks like First Assembly, where brother and sister are the names that we give one another. I'm going to read to you from the First Nations version, an indigenous translation of the New Testament. I am so excited to own this because it was written by a man who is part Ojibwe, and we are worshiping on Dakota land. So I'm going to read to you the picture that that is cast, actually more a report of what was actually happening in the church that made me think of First Assembly. So this newly formed family continued daily to learn from the 12 message bearers. They lived together in harmony, ate ceremonial meals, and prayed with one another. Great respect and awe came down upon all, and the message bearers performed many signs. As these followers lived together in peace, their harmony grew stronger, and they shared all things. Many of them had a giveaway to provide for all who were in need. Each day they gathered at the sacred lodge. With good and pure hearts, they feasted together in their homes and shared the ceremonial meal of fried bread and wine given to them by Creator Sets Free, which is the name used for Jesus. Creator Sets Free. They gave honor and thanks to the Great Spirit and were respected by the people. Each day, Creator sent more people who were being set free to join with them. Set free. That was my experience of church when I was a little sister. Church was so important to me. It was a space of freedom, of connection, of seeing generosity, and like I said, real joy. It was a place where I could luxuriate in the idea of being a little sister because that meant somebody was looking out for me. Somebody was praying for me. Somebody was checking in on me. Somebody wanted to protect me and care for me. Church was important to me, and I wanted to be there every chance I got, which was convenient because First AG had a Sunday morning, an evening, and a Sunday evening, and then a Wednesday evening service. Instead of taking me home after morning service, my godparents, Mickey and Missy, who were leaders at First AG, offered to help me or keep me with them on Sundays. So I would go from church to their house and I would have lunch with them. And then I would sleep in the antiques room, which was amazing because Missy had all of these antique mirrors, and so there were all these little mirrors and all these little compacts and little dolls, and I know, like we're in October, so all things feel a little spooky. So I guess you can imagine little antique dolls could be a little spooky, but it wasn't for me. It felt safe. It was wonderful, and I slept in that room for after church naps, and then we would have dinner together, and then go to Sunday evening service. And then Barry, who was the children's pastor and then eventually the youth pastor, would pick me up on Wednesdays. And so he would bring me to church, and I would be able to spend more time with all these people. And John would come in and pat me on the back and ask me how my week went, if there was anything that I needed prayer for, because I'd been in school the first couple days and I had a couple more days of school left. I crafted my life around being at church, not because I loved learning about God, which I did, but because I was falling in love with the people. They reflected the love of Jesus. They reflected Creator Sets Free to me in such an unguarded way when we gathered. And I believe in my heart it's because coming together with other believers gave them permission, set them free to say, the kindness I have, the joy I have, the provision that I have, the delight I have, it's all because of Jesus. We were able to talk freely and openly about Jesus and encourage each other to follow Jesus in a way that I was not encouraged in any other space in my life. My dad saw this, and I come from a very culturally Christian home, if at best, maybe a little bit antagonistic to faith. And my dad saw this, and very soon church attendance was the one thing he'd take away from me as discipline if I got anything less than a B. And there was this stretch in junior high when I just could not for the life of me figure out algebra, and nothing worked. And so I got an F at progress report time, and so my dad took church away. I couldn't go on Sunday mornings. I couldn't go on Sunday evenings. I couldn't go to youth. I couldn't even go to a prayer meeting. Nothing. I could not go to church. His reasoning was I would use that time to study, but I didn't. I filled it with watching TV. I found community by talking on the phone with my best friend Beth and took long bike rides around my neighborhood. I laid in the yard with my dogs and sat under the tree and read Little Women or Never-Ending Story. I created new rhythms, a bedtime one that included a vanilla scented candles and journaling, and a morning one of stretching and playing worship music. I tried to integrate God in all of these ways and all these things. Because I thought if I can't be with God's people, at least I can think about God when I'm at home. I filled that my time that used to be dedicated to being at church with good things. Things that help me understand my unique wiring, things that to this day I still keep in my self-care rotation. All these things were good. But I found myself lying in bed at night thinking about God and wondering who I could talk to. If I had a question, I would run to my journal and try to write it down and tell myself, the next time I go to church, I will ask this question. If I did pick up my Bible to try to answer those questions during that time, I'd just write question marks in the margins. I once asked my dad, how am I supposed to be a Christian if I can't go to church? And he said, Osheta, Jesus is with you wherever you go. That's enough. Which in some respects is totally true. But it didn't sit well with me. See, I started to think, why did Jesus gather his disciples to walk with him as a group, as a community, as a family? If Jesus with me one-on-one is enough, then why didn't he walk with the disciples one-on-one? Why aren't the Gospels filled with more of these individual conversations that Jesus had? I totally believe that Jesus invested individually with each and every disciple and committed follower. I do. But that's not what I saw in the Bible. That's not what I saw highlighted in the Bible. What I saw was Jesus seeking out individuals, seeking out outcasts, seeking out those on the margins and bringing them in to community, to family, and asking them to center their relationships with each other around him and his teachings. To work out your differences with each other, with me in your midst as your mediator. To be your whole full selves, be vulnerable with each other because I am going to show you how to be vulnerable too. 2 months later, I finally brought my grade up and my dad said I could go to church again, but I almost didn't want to. Even though I had all these questions about church and community and connection, I was really comfortable being on my own. I was really comfortable with my own rhythms. In fact, I was becoming satisfied with my makeshift spiritual regimen. So much so that I didn't even tell Mickey or Missy or Barry that I could come back to church. But my mama did. One day, Missy saw Mama at the store she worked and mentioned how much she misses me at church and how she can't wait for me to get off punishment. And Mama straight up ratted me out. She said, oh, she's been off of punishment for a few weeks now. That night, Missy called me and said, hey, Osheta, can we pick you up for church on Sunday? We miss our daughter. In fact, lots of people miss you. I said yes, but spent the next few days sick to my stomach. I was nervous about going back. What would people think of me? What questions would they ask of me? What did I miss? Do I have to start at the beginning? I really, really didn't want to go. But Sunday night, Missy said she was stopping at Shipley's Donuts, which was the best donuts in Texas City, on her way to pick me up the next day, and she was going to bring me my favorite, a glazed donut. And y'all, I was a broke 15-year-old who loved her some donuts. I relented and she picked me up. Actually, I think I was more like 13. So I walked up to those double doors of my church. And John swung open his door and he said, there's my little sister. And I knew I was home. I knew I was among family. I knew that being a daughter didn't carry the weight of disappointment and regret that I felt at home, and being a sister didn't carry the shame and sadness that I felt at home. That being a daughter and a sister meant something rooted in love because of Jesus. The members of First AG had become my family. I was theirs, and they were mine. And no matter what, to them I was daughter and sister, because we were all brothers and sisters in Christ. I decided then and there that no matter what happens in my spiritual life, no matter how angry I got with God, and trust me, y'all, I got real angry with God, and no matter what theological journeys I went on, what deconstruction I would do, that in my reconstruction, I would hold on to two things: Jesus and my connection with other disciples through some configuration of the local church. The one with the words of life and the ones who try to embody them. This is what church is when it becomes a forged family, a life-giving space where brother and sister mean beloved and belonging. We are continuing our series on the church's forged family. And we're going to continue to have this conversation about church and how to become a community that reflects not the brand or marketing or restaurantized institution or exclusionary social club that often gets confused with the church, but church as a formed family. It's difficult because maybe you're like me and you've actually figured out some things that are important to you because thanks to the pandemic, church was taken off of your weekly schedule. So I want to say from the outset that I get how a conversation about why church and becoming the church may seem irrelevant to you. Like I said at the beginning, I will say it again and I will say it to your face. I understand. It is a triggering kind of conversation. For a few months in my teens and nearly once a year, church still seems irrelevant to me. I still have to ask myself those same questions I asked my father. Why don't we see Jesus just always investing one-on-one with people? Why do we see if he invests one-on-one, it's always an individual who he's talking to amidst a group of others? Why is it important to come together? Listen, I recently realized that I'm probably more introverted than I would like to admit. People drain me sometimes. I am almost always taking stock of my emotional reserves, how many spoons I have for relational connection. And I get that sometimes church feels like it's a spoon that you're not willing to give. But it is a spoon that whenever I give it, I am served back love. I am served back hope. I am served back inclusion. Oftentimes when I am saying church isn't relevant to me, what I'm really saying is I want something more than self-righteousness and authenticity and obligation. I don't want to go to church just to feel like a good person or just to put on a happy face or just because I'm told to. No, I want to be in a church because watching Jonas and Asher cling to Naomi reminds me that God is mother. And hearing Libby sing her heart out reminds me that God sings peace over me. Or when I wave at Joanna and she looks up at Lydia to check in with her mom first before waving at me, I'm reminded to check in with the Spirit, even if something looks or sounds good. I want to see what fabulous outfit Vinny is going to wear to church and how he, at 3, is expressing the freedom of Christ in his unique little way. I want to be at church because Otto is curiosity and courage embodied. And when I think of Jesus' words to be like the children, I think of him. I want to be at church because Juice always comes through with the dad jokes, and Janie with the mom hugs, and Emily with the cool aunt insights. They share these gifts with us to remind us that God is generous and present. And there are so many examples of how you roots, when you show up just being yourselves, reveal God to me. You roots are my answer to why church. I want to be in church This church, because we're forging a family. We're not feeding dehumanizing institutions or stroking our egos with exclusivity or virtual signaling to impress. Because this is what we see in the disciples in the early church. They were an embodied, forged family. They lived together in harmony. They ate for nourishment and remembrance of Creator set free, Jesus. They shared resources and ideas. They invited each other into their homes. They centered the Great Spirit. They were set free together. After the live stream, we're having a Zoom town hall meeting where we're going to talk about this weird moment in the pandemic, where we're slowly exploring gathering as a church in in-person gatherings. And if I'm honest with you, a few months ago, when the news about the Delta variant was spreading, and before I left Woodland staff, I looked at Pastor TC and said, what if we just don't go back in person? What if we just stayed online? And he reminded me that we are working on this series about being a forged family. He invited me to start asking those questions. What are you saying when you're saying you don't want church or you're afraid to go back to church? I decided to process some of those questions that were really rooted in some of my anxieties with my therapist and pray about my resistance. One of those prayer times was when I was stirring oatmeal at my stove and reading the big sign on my wall about the early church. And 2 words stood out to me: glad and sincere hearts. We're about to move into the town hall where we're going to offer some ideas on how we can reclaim some joy and authenticity of being a forged family that we may have been missing because of the pandemic and all of the pivots. So in closing, I want to share with you this reflection from Howard Thurman. I've been reading a lot of Howard Thurman because I'm basing our Advent series on Thurman, and I just love this reflection from him. So Howard Thurman has this beautiful reflection called The Season of Ingathering. And that's what we're in right now, Roots, a season of ingathering. This is a time of gathering in, the season of the harvest in nature. Many things that were started in the spring and early summer have grown to fruition and are now ready for reaping. Great and insignificant as is the harvest in nature, the most pertinent kind of ingathering for the human spirit is the harvest of the heart. Long ago, Jesus said that men should not lay up for themselves treasures on earth where moths corrupt and thieves break in and steal, but that men should lay up for themselves treasures in heaven. This insight suggests that life consists of planting and harvesting, of sowing and reaping. We are always in the midst of the harvest and always in the midst of the planting. The words that we use in communication, the profound stirrings of the mind of which thoughts and ideas arise, the ebb and flow of desires out of which the simple or complex deed develops, are all caught in the process of reaping and sowing, of planting and harvesting. There are no anonymous deeds, no casual processes. Living is a shared experience. Even as a man is conscious of things growing in him, planted by others, which things are always ripening, so others are conscious of things growing in them, planted by him, which things are always ripening. Inasmuch as he does not live or die unto himself, it is of the essence of wisdom for him consciously to live and die in the profound awareness of other people. The statement, know thyself, has been taken mystically from the statement, thou hast seen thy brother or sister, thou hast seen thy God. A couple things. Thurman's writing was of a time where he could not use or would not use inclusive language because that just wasn't part of the way they wrote. But he was such an inclusive, such a thoughtful mystic and leader. I know that today he would use more inclusive language, incorporating she and they. But Roots, that's my prayer for us. We are going to embark on a season of ingathering. We're going to talk more about that in the town hall, but my prayer for us is that we can be vulnerable with each other about our anxieties and fears, that we can bring our hopes and dreams to our gatherings, and that we can begin to be a circle of friends. We can be a forged family with Christ in the middle. I hope to see you at the Zoom town hall after the gathering. I love you all. Thank you for revealing God to me in profound and unique ways. Amen and amen.